This is Duke University.
So Thomas Jefferson called the American Declaration of Independence an instrument pregnant with our own and the fate of the world. Historian David Armitage notes that the American Declaration became a model for a global array of similar documents asserting the independence of contested states. In Haiti, a nation now known to most Americans as a site of complex humanitarian emergency, the documents related to the process of declaring independence have shed light on the plurality of participants in articulating the document, preserving it, and then spreading the word on freedom in a very nuanced and urgent sense. In the summer of 2012, a man employed in the automotive industry in France emailed me to ask my opinion on a copy of the Haitian Declaration of Independence that he had found in the papers of Saint-Domingue colonist Jean-Baptiste Pierre-Aimé de Longpré, and I believe you all have a little bio about Longpré. I did think that the copy looked authentic, and more than that, anomalous, because it was characterized by phonetic spellings as one might hear a name, for example, rather than as it is conventionally written. And this was especially true of the names of the generals who are the signatories to the declaration. And unconventional separations of words, the words often blurred together into these fusiform phrases with no separation and no punctuation. And punctuation throughout is minimal. There are fewer paragraph separations and than in the government-issued printed text, and French accents in this copy are rare and mostly wrongly applied. A sentence was missing and another sentence was repeated. A concluding sentence was phrased slightly but importantly differently in this copy. So was this copy transcribed by someone hearing a print copy that was read out at the time of the independence? Julia Gaffield unearthed in the British National Archives the only known copy that was printed by the Haitian government of the Declaration. And this version is different enough that we can imagine someone listening, remembering, and writing, but someone not in the actual circle of formal members of the government. In other words, a member of the nascent Haitian public. There is support for this hypothesis. Only one other manuscript copy among the known half dozen in the world's archives resembles it. And that copy was definitively acquired and certified by the signature of a French general, Ferrand, who was the nemesis of Dessalines from what is now the Dominican Republic in the early era of the independence. And it was sent to Napoleon, and therefore we know that that one, which resembles ours quite a bit, was from that very early independence era. The leader of the Haitian independence in 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, was illiterate in terms of the Western alphabet and print tradition. Yet his dictation and editing via secretaries of independence proclamations marks him as a remarkable, if paradoxical, man of letters and political thinker. He is an early star of radical Afro-diasporic philosophy in a multilingual lineage that extends on to Frederick Douglass, Frantz Fanon, and Malcolm X. Susan Buck-Morse drew the world's attention to the synergy of Hegelian and Haitian revolutionary thought in her famous essay, Hegel and Haiti, suggesting that Hegel may have been inspired by reading about the Haitian Revolution in contemporary newspapers. She noted the appropriateness of an otherwise oblique line by Hegel and linked it to the Haitian revolutionary context. That line is, "Even if I was born into slavery, I am emancipated at the moment of wanting to be freed." And there is no doubt that Dessalines developed what one might describe as a kind of Hegelian dialectic of freedom throughout this body of his proclamations. He aimed, after all, in the Haitian Declaration of Independence to consolidate your freedom by laws that guarantee your free individuality. He said, "We dared to be free when we were not free, by ourselves and for ourselves." He stated in his acceptance of his imperial nomination in the fall of 1804, "I am rich only in your freedom." But we found in researching German newspapers that although Hegel would have read a great deal of negative reporting about the Haitian Revolution, he would have had access to a virtual anthology of Dessalines' political proclamations, since several of them were published together in the German newspaper Minerva. In other words, Hegel may have been inspired directly by the philosophy of Dessalines in texts including this Haitian Declaration of Independence. This leads one to wonder, was Dessalines' Hegelian dialectic really Hegel's Dessalinian dialectic? Do we have to have Hegel to have Haiti in a certain sense? And should we continue to reverse that directionality? And finally, before we move on to Laurent's contextualization of the historical moment, why January 21st? Why are we celebrating Haitian independence on January 21st? There are two different reasons. One is that there is evidence from documentation and correspondence that the Haitian government printed version of the Declaration of Independence was printed this week and circulated in that third week of January. The other is that there is an oblique mention of January 21st as the date of Dessalines' founding of the Republic of the Incas. This is not a structure that became permanent, but there is an early independence document that speaks of the Inca army. And since the Declaration of Independence is very prominently labeled as a document of the Armée Indigène, the indigenous army, it's important to think about this January 21st altar day of independence. And one thing that Claire didn't mention is that for our reception tonight, we will be having soup joumou, okay? So it really is Independence Day.
Voila. Sorry. Well, I want to thank Deborah for that opening. And I'm going to just briefly mention the people on the panel, give some contextualizing context, and then we will have a bigger discussion. We're really lucky to have here today, partly for an event we're having tomorrow as well about museum curatorial work. Richard Rabinowitz on my far right, who is the director of the American History Workshop, along with Linda Kaplan. Richard and Linda were the curators of an exhibit called Revolution, the Atlantic World Reborn, that really did an important work of putting the Haitian Revolution in front of an American audience for the first time at the New York Historical Society. And I've been really familiar with the kind of public importance, the importance of having these types of documents, I think, to make the history of Haiti known in the United States. So it can kind of help us talk about that. Julia Gaffield here was a graduate of the doctoral program at Duke, got her PhD here, is currently a postdoc at Brandeis University, and has worked very closely on early Haitian independence. My name is Laurent Dubois. I'm a historian of Haiti here at Duke. I just want to say a few words about why this document is so kind of vital in our understanding of modern history. Of course, this was the second independence declaration after the U.S. Declaration of Independence. And if you contrast the two, in some ways they couldn't be more different in tone and in form. In fact, the story goes that when Dessalines was sort of there was originally an earlier draft of this Declaration of Independence, as told in Ardouin and other sources, that actually imitated the model of Jefferson a bit more, imitated the U.S. model, and Dessalines kind of rejected it, suggesting that this was not appropriate for Haiti, that the moment of Haiti required a different kind of rhetoric. And it is interesting and important to understand that this Declaration of Independence came at the end of a very brutal war, right? So unlike the American Declaration of Independence, which is kind of a declaration of war, an opening of a war, the Haitian Declaration of Independence in some ways is a meditation on the problem of creating a nation at a moment of kind of catastrophe, of devastation, right? A country that had been ripped apart on a nearly genocidal campaign by the French against Haitian troops, killing of even loyal black soldiers who were imprisoned by the French. So a real kind of cataclysm, a great deal of destruction in order to win independence. And there's a way in which the Haitian Declaration of Independence kind of surveys this landscape, not only of the recent conflict, but all the kind of history of slavery itself that had led to it. So a kind of epical and prophetic tone to the document. And I'll read a few passages from it in a moment. The challenge, of course, for Dessalines was a very unique challenge, a very different challenge than the founders of the United States. As Deborah mentioned, first of all, simply the fact of kind of creating a nation out of a population that was in fact majority African-born. So most people in Haiti in 1804 had been born, raised in Africa, brought as enslaved people to Haiti. Of kind of anchoring, creating a kind of new indigeneity, laying claim on the landscape. And thus the evocations of the indigenous, like the army of the Incas and so forth, are in a way of linking up the Haitian population with the larger indigenous population symbolically. And also it's interesting that he really evokes the presence of the dead in the landscape. There's a whole passage in the Declaration of Independence that in a sense calls upon the memory of all those who had died in the conflict and before, almost as guarantors of independence. Sort of the ancestors are there watching and expecting Haitians to kind of follow through with the project and to make it live as well. So all those things make the text itself really significant. I hope that Julia may say a few more words about this, but one of the intriguing things about this document is that unlike the US Declaration of Independence, which was produced kind of almost over-disseminated, or maybe not over-disseminated, but it was produced, a lot of pamphlets, a lot of reproduction of it. People had a lot of access to the written document. The more we research it, we realize that the access within Haiti and outside Haiti to the document itself was often problematic or limited in certain ways. And so I think what Deborah suggested is that this document here that we'll see downstairs is a really interesting kind of insight into the way in which people circulated this declaration and the way in which the importance of these words was kind of transmitted and retranscribed and so forth. So we have, in the past years, especially led by Deborah and also Julia's work, really thought about here at Duke about the kind of history of this document, and it's very exciting to be able to continue that and to continue that process here. The document, of course, will be digitized and made available so that other researchers can look at it online or can come and see it. And I think it'll be a really generative experience. So I want to also thank the libraries for having taken this great step. Let me just end by, I'll actually read a passage from the Declaration in French. We're going to hear it tonight in 3 languages. So I'll read a little in French, Julia will read a little in English, and later Jacques-Pierre will read from his Creole language translation of the document. But I think it's worth just spending a little time with the text. So here's the opening and 1 or 2 other lines. Citoyens, ce n'est pas assez d'avoir expulsé de votre pays les barbares qui l'ont ensanglanté depuis 2 siècles. Ce n'est pas assez d'avoir mis un frein aux factions toujours renaissantes qui se jouaient tour à tour du fantôme de liberté que la France exposait à vos yeux. Il faut, par un dernier acte d'autorité nationale, assurer à jamais l'empire de la liberté dans le pays qui nous a vu naître. Il faut ravir au gouvernement inhumain qui tient depuis longtemps nos esprits dans la torpeur la plus humiliante, tout espoir de nous réasservir. Il faut enfin vivre libre, vivre indépendant ou mourir. Indépendance ou la mort, que ces mots sacrés nous rallient et qu'ils soient le signal des combats et de notre réunion. And I'll just read one more phrase. It's one of, I think, the most interesting. There's a moment, and it's actually the invention of a new verb in the Haitian Declaration of Independence. One of the lines says simply, le nom français lugubre encore nos contrées. Right, so the idea that something about this independence was about freeing oneself from the kind of French haunting, the haunting not of only of France, but of colonialism, of slavery, of unmaking that history. And in a broader sense, of course, this is the beginning of a long struggle in Haiti to kind of to remake a society, to reverse the legacies of plantation slavery, to create a new alternative, a struggle that Haiti has often paid for in kind of condemnation and isolation from other countries. But also a struggle that is sort of at the core of the national identity in Haiti as well. So I'll pass the microphone on to Julia. I think it's the front. That's what I ended up doing. How many doctorates? Here's another solution.
Oh, there we go. So I got it. It's on. Sorry, now I have to bring it closer. One quick comment also about January 21st. A very unique document, a song dedicated to Jean-Jacques Dessalines called the Hymne Haïtien, Haitian Hymn, was also composed and sung for the first time on January 21st, 1804. So also a very special day in Haiti's history. I just wanted to say a couple of things about the different copies of the Declaration of Independence that are available. There are very few, which is why the document that Duke recently purchased is so special. And up until very recently, no official copies were known to have existed in any archive in Haiti or elsewhere. I had the good fortune of finding two of these official copies, both at the National Archives in London. One is a pamphlet version, and then one is a big broadside. They were both in the Jamaican records at the National Archives, one in the Admiralty, and then one in the governor's papers. But you would expect unofficial copies also to be available. However, these are also few and far between. There are two at the National Archives in Paris, and there is one at the National Library of Jamaica. Patrick Teldier, an archivist in Haiti, suspects that in one of the archives there might be a copy, although yet to be confirmed. And then historian Ada Ferrer suspects that there might be transcriptions in Cuba and in Spain, although her notes only note translations of the document. So another kind of cool part of the story, but not transcriptions in French. And so this document that Duke now has is in a minority. Given how important this document was, how widely publicized it was in newspapers, the lack of manuscript documents or manuscripts in different archives, I think is pretty surprising. There are also kind of interesting differences in terms of the location in the archive. The two at the National Archives in Paris and the one at the National Library of Jamaica are all in government, I guess, folders or the papers of government officials. Whereas, and I think we'll learn a bit more from Will later about how this document came into the U.S., but it's not a government official. And so it says something else about the circulation of the text. For almost all of the documents, the scribes are unknown. Even the one that's signed by Ferrand, it was probably his secretary or something, so we don't know exactly who is copying the text or from what source. But I think this specific document at Duke really suggests that it's worth continuing the search because we've checked out most of the official archives, but if there are more in personal papers, I think it would be another really interesting story about the circulation of documents, information, who this document was important to, why it was important. And so not to, devalue the copy that Duke now has, but hopefully more will kind of come to the surface in the years to come, and I think it will allow us to get a better understanding of the importance of Haiti's independence in the Atlantic world. So I'll just read a translation of a translation by Laurent, actually, of the the part that he just read, and the translation is available online. If you just Google Haitian Declaration of Independence, a Duke site comes up as the first hit, and you can find the translation there. And I've always dreamed of co-teaching a class with a theater department or something in which students would perform all of these speeches and proclamations. So I will not do it justice, but someday maybe. So it's addressed to from the Commander-in-Chief to the people of Haiti. Citizens, it is not enough to have expelled the barbarians who have bloodied our land for 2 centuries. It is not enough to have restrained those ever-evolving factions that one after another mocked the specter of liberty that France dangled before you. We must, with one last act of national authority, forever assure the empire of liberty in the country of our birth. We must take any hope of re-enslaving us away from the inhuman government that for so long kept us in the most humiliating torpor. In the end, we must live independent or die. Independence or death, let these sacred words unite us and be the signal of battle and of our reunion. Citizens, my countrymen, on this solemn day I have brought together those courageous soldiers who, as liberty lay dying, spilled their blood to save it. These generals who have guided your efforts against tyranny have not yet done enough for your happiness. The French name still haunts our land. And then a little bit later, a quotation that Deborah also read. We have dared to be free. Let us be thus by ourselves and for ourselves. And one comment, the additional verb that Laurent mentioned, lugubre, in 1804 gets translated by a British translator as over clouds, which is not exactly the right word, but it's kind of clear that they didn't really know what to do with it.
Richard, do you want to add anything now, or you want to just?
Well, I just want to say it's delightful to be here. Laurent and I, working with Laurent is a great pleasure. So as you know, we're dressed today as in the colors of the Haitian flag. We didn't plan to do that, but it's symbolic of the kind of collaboration we've had. When Julia's discovery was announced, it was an extraordinarily eventful moment in the development of our project. One of our friends, one of the colleagues we had working on the project, a Haitian woman, said it was the greatest event, the greatest news of her life. She was so excited by the discovery of this printed version of the Declaration. So it became for us in developing this exhibition a kind of the ultimate document, the thing that we would drive the whole exhibition toward this. We had started working in 2004 on this project. The president of the New York Historical Society had read Laurent's book on Avengers of the New World, and she wanted to do an exhibition on revolutions, on the age of revolution, and she, after reading Laurent's book, she said, well, we have to include Haiti, which I thought was just a wonderful thing to do and exciting. And of course, we had about 4,000, 5,000 square feet to mount this exhibition. And in thinking about how to organize an exhibition in New York City on the age of revolution, we decided, well, there have been an awful lot of exhibitions on the American Revolution. And what could we say that would be original? And there were probably not a lot of exhibits in the United States on the French Revolution, but given the space we had, what could we say about the French Revolution? It was so complicated. But more importantly, we felt that the presence of several 100,000 Haitians and Haitian Americans in New York and the metropolitan area made it really vital to put the Haitian Revolution at the center of our story, and in a sense to see that as the culmination of the narrative of the age of revolutions. And so it proved to be that the population came to the exhibition and saw Linda was able to go to London and to convince the British, the National Archives in London to let us borrow the document and to bring it to New York. And we mounted it in a lovely gallery, and we had the translations put onto page-turner software so that you could walk through the document in English and Creole and French. I should say that we also felt it was important to translate all of the key texts in the exhibition and key audio pieces into French and to Creole, which is not often done in the United States. So, but for the Haitian community who came to that exhibition, this was, I think, an extraordinary opportunity to see themselves, see the heritage of their country in such a proud place. And it was really a very moving experience, and to show an American audience to some extent that although we fetishize the Declaration of Independence as part of our national tendency in the United States to fetishize our foundation documents. And that's probably the chief product of our revolution, is that reverence we have for the written word. the great thing about putting this other document at the center of our story, as the point culminant of our narrative, was, I think, just an extraordinarily important gesture for the people of New York, Haitian and non-Haitian alike. So it was an extraordinary experience, and all through the course of that exhibition for 5 months, Haitians and Haitian Americans came to see the show, brought groups of people, and church groups and lodge groups, and it was and school groups. It was a wonderful experience. So that, I think it's worth saying that documents like this have a tremendous public symbolic significance when they become part of the civic space, and it's rare in the United States that we acknowledge the pieces of the culture, the history, the politics of other countries. So that was a really proud moment for me.
Well, great. Well, thank you all.